MHA, we've been in business for 17 years. I started the firm back when I was with MHA. I was with MHA before I started with Bank of America, before I started MHA. 17 years later, we're not just a domestic consulting firm, but global as well. Our folks are very senior. We have a number of SaaS tools that we use, not just to measure compliance, but risk, and a number of, as well as BIAs, and we found those very helpful over time to help us with our clients. You know, our mission is very simple: just ensure the continuous operations of our clients' critical processes. Our client base is very varied. Again, we're across all of the industry verticals. We don't focus just in one. And what we see over time is working with many of these clients is we see those that do measure compliance. You know, they are able to then change behavior, processes, and methodology, which makes them more successful, which lowers their residual risk. Compliance and residual risk go hand in hand. Very important to remember that. Some folks say, I don't need to measure compliance, I could care less. Well, it does drive your residual risk. Because again, if you have the right behaviors, processes, and methodology, it will positively impact residual risk over time. Now, it doesn't mean as you start out, you're not going to have high residual risk and low compliance. All programs start out that way, but over time, you can develop the right roadmap and approach to get high compliance and low risk. Will you ever have zero risk? No, it's almost impossible unless you have unlimited money, resources, etc. But it's great to see people over time reduce those. MHA, as we said before, we provide pretty much a full complement of services from assessing where you're at today to recovery strategies, developing the right plans, conducting the right exercise, and then through the maintenance process. Won't spend much time on that again. Most of the folks that know MHA know pretty comprehensive solution practices overall and through all of those individual clients over time, the last 17 years. Okay, we're going to do a couple things today. We're going to talk about assessing BCM program residual risk, discuss compliance and how it works hand in hand with residual risk, learn about the impact of assessing risk in your program. What's the process to assess residual risk? Keep it simple. The residual risk formula has been out there forever, so it's nothing unusual or new. It just hasn't been applied to business continuity as much as it is now. And then what do you do after assessing residual risk? What is it when I identify where it is? Do I have to fix my policy, my standards, better enforcement, more participation, more money? How does that work and how do I get there? And overall, let at the end provide a clear picture of really, you know, what are the key components of residual risk and for you to understand those. Talk a little bit about risk tolerance or appetite, the inherent risk factor, the threat landscape, and very important, the mitigating control. So we'll cover each of these and how they apply to assessing residual risk. Now, typically, you know, when you talk about assessing the program, there's a very traditional approach. Most people are worried about their documentation. How good is it? Is it not good? Is it good enough to meet the auditors? Most people a lot of times only worry about it, does it pass audit, but is it not executable, which is very critical. A lot of times most programs now are audit driven. We see that a lot with those clients. Some are just willing to, again, do the checklist, do the check mark, we're done. And then lastly, nobody's calculating ROI. One of the key things we're finding out by knowing our level of compliance, by knowing our residual risk, I truly believe these two factors are what you can use to calculate return on investment on your program. And that's going to be something we're going to be working on in the future and probably ask a number of folks to help us brainstorm in the industry. But I believe by knowing compliance and residual risk, I can now then calculate what my return on investment of my program is. And then lastly, you know, the traditional approach has always been compliance with industry standards. That's important, but we got to move to the next evolution, which is really quantitatively really knowing where my pockets of risk are. Is it due to the fact that my pockets of risk are very poor recovery strategies or very poor recovery exercises which are leading to higher residual risk? Or is it to the fact that our plans aren't well developed, et cetera? Also clearly knowing what magnitude of residual risk are we willing to accept, which is hard at times for management to understand. And what we found, management many times over will go ahead and accept more risk than you think, which is very interesting. Also, by you knowing specifically where these pockets of risk are, what are the potential ways to minimize the risk? Better change behavior, heighten up the standards, make them more stringent. Again, implement better strategies. Could we more to a more resilient model that everybody wants to get to by diversity of operations, et cetera? And then by then target those efforts. How do we do this over time and maybe not try to get them all done at once, but have a very strategic roadmap how to reduce our risk over time. And very importantly, use our tool and ability to calculate residual risk on what is most critical to our organization. I really don't need to worry about those in the 10-day, 14-day. Gosh, if I could start to know where my residual risk lies within the most critical plans of my organization, those that I need in 24 or less, 48, or even up to 5 days, and focus on really reducing risk, which those we know really keep our company running. And lastly, by knowing where everything is, you can then better focus time, money, and resources. Here's the big picture. Of course, everybody knows we're trying to balance that huge rock over here called risk. How do we balance it with the right level of maturity for what's best for us as an organization? Everybody's level of maturity and compliance also goes along with how highly regulated am I? Do I need to be world class? Can I be in the middle? Can I just get a few things done and still be okay based on my expectations, my criticality, my recovery time requirements, etc. And most importantly, also our readiness, because it all comes down to I may be mature and compliant, but how ready or executable am I? And then, of course, balancing all of this is the resilience we all want to get to. Very few organizations are truly resilient, or at least getting to a level of resilience. I think over time that will happen, but it's going to take a lot of time, money, resources, and effort. Technology is getting us there, which is a big help on the resilience side. As many organizations grow, they're putting in diversity of operation. They're doing a number of different things that, whether they know it or not in their business model, gives them diversity and of operation, which helps resilience. But I believe organizations over time, those that are critical to our infrastructure, to our business environments, they will have to move to a high level of resilience based on what's happening today in the threat landscape and many other factors, within corporate America, cyber attacks, et cetera, as we've seen, very critical to have a high level of resilience. Okay, what's compliance? Basically you're in accordance with established standards, guidelines, and directives. It looks at all kinds of different areas in your program, your management oversight, your standards, your policies, your methodology, your documentation, and then it looks at a number of areas as well. How good am I at administering my program, my crisis management, business recovery? And then overall, by assessing this, it kind of gives you an idea, low, medium, or high. But it's very important you know compliance because it really tells you, do I have the right behaviors? Is my process in place properly? Is my documentation in order and the methodology, which then all drive residual risk? Here's what we've seen in our subscribers and that use our tools as well as we consult with. Those that have low levels of compliance will traditionally or typically have high levels of residual risk. And then vice versa. High levels of compliance, typically over time you'll see the residual risk decline dramatically over time. But what is residual risk? It's the risk that remains after all efforts have been made to identify and eliminate risk. Okay, so that's really important. Risk that remains after efforts have been made to identify and eliminate risk. Basically what it is in the business continuity side is identifying what is the inherent risk, taking into account what management then is willing to accept as its risk tolerance, and then that saying based on these items, the inherent risk and the risk tolerance, what's the state of the controls we have to protect that specific component we're trying to evaluate the risk? Are those controls in good shape, not good? And with that, then we subtract that and we end up with residual risk. What's remaining? Are we within the tolerance or not? One of the things you may also find by doing this, which is very helpful to you, is you may find that you may be doing more than you need to. You may actually be protecting assets more than you need to, and you may end up with what we call or end up with a negative residual risk, which means I'm doing too much. Based on the inherent risk with that component, based on what management tolerance is for that, you may be putting so much into it, you may be wasting money, time, or effort. Now, does that happen? Absolutely. We've seen that happen with clients where they implement strategies where they say, we don't want to accept any risk. And they implement the most gold medal type strategies and solutions and spend all the money, which you end up finding out, you end up getting into problems. You're spending too much money and effort for what the criticality or the risk is of the unit. So that's another good piece of understanding residual risk. So we talked about it already. What is residual risk? It's defined as the remaining risk after controls have been implemented and monitored and the effect of their findings considered. As you'll see a little bit later, we're going to be doing this at the business recovery or system recovery plan level. So basically, we're going to be identifying for that recovery plan what its inherent risk is and looking at the different controls that we have for recovery plans. Your impact analysis, recovery plan, recovery team, recovery exercises, third-party risk. Those are all the controls we've seen and what we recommend that you look at for a plan. Those are the controls we have to understand how good they are as to what level. So Residual risk, as I stated earlier, considers the inherent risk, which is really how critical is that plan or component. And it's that inherent risk is before we take any of the controls into consideration. Out of that too, we identify the risk tolerance or willingness to accept risk. Now, very important, management has to help you set this risk tolerance. What we have found, number one, you're going to have a high learning curve. You need to educate your management on risk tolerance. Very, very important. You need to let them know if they choose a low risk tolerance, what that means versus high risk tolerance. Low risk tolerance, when you set this up, means you're going to have tighter, more stringent controls. But with that, of course, comes higher cost for strategy, higher cost for recovery exercises, more resources versus higher tolerance. Your controls may not need to be as stringent because you're willing to accept more risk. So you're going to have to educate your management and continually do that so they understand what they're doing and how that affects your program, your resources, your time, your costs, etc. Now, by doing this, your process assess and evaluate the state of controls. So you have to have a good process, and you can't just do this once. Once you go through your critical plans and you take a look at their inherent risk and you calculate what the remaining, the state of their controls, you can't just do this once. You need to do this on a regular basis. Because how many of you have had business units that do exceedingly well, they're really good, but guess what? They miss a recovery test, or they don't update their plan, or the BIA becomes out of date. Well, that affects their residual risk. So you've got to do this on a prescribed basis, whether that's we recommend at least once a year. So very important. It's not just once, it's on a regular basis. Now, out of all this, as I stated, basically what happens is once you're done calculating this, the whole deliverable, the entire deliverable enchilada is, am I within the tolerance or outside of it? And am I within it? Okay, is that great? Am I doing too much? Or am I doing just the right amount? This plan is in good shape. Or am I outside the tolerance? How bad is it? And what do I need to attack in order to fix it and reduce that risk? That's the whole crux of residual risk. Now, why should we consider it? Really simple. It gives you a quantitative evaluation. If I go and ask folks today, where does your risk is? And I can tell you, the majority of clients we work with, or even just in the industry, when I've done surveys in the classes I've taken, the majority of risk lies in two areas within the controls. It lies within recovery strategy, and it lies within recovery exercises. And I'll tell you that you can basically tell it for most folks. They don't do a good enough job on developing a strategy that actually works and can be executed to the fullest. And then secondly, what we find is most people are not exercising to the fullest. Most are still stuck in the desktop walkthrough. Very few are reaching the highest level you'd want them to, where it's an actual failover and they're actually testing or running business at the other location for a period of time. There are those that are doing that, and those are the ones we always thought that have the lowest residual risk. So it gives you a quantitative evaluation, allows you to target your efforts. Secondly, we really believe this. We're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in staff salaries alone in BCM now, in many offices, let alone millions. I've seen offices now that have 15 people, 20 people. We're spending so much money just on the BCM office, not let alone on strategies and solutions, that management, I'm amazed, has not said, hey, you really do need to optimize where you're putting our money and time and resources while minimizing risk. I think we're looking now as to where do I need to spend my money where I again minimize the risk the most and give me the highest level of recoverability. So this really helps you with that. So in the perfect world, you definitely want the lowest possible residual risk for your critical units. By doing that, you basically are assuring management, I have a very good chance of recoverability for my organization. Super, super important. So lower the risk, the better. As we all know, the higher the residual risk, especially in critical units, you have a bigger opportunity for a greater impact. Okay. So I'm going to give you an example here. And we used this in the class and it worked well. So let's just take for an example that we have a toddler, new toddler in our house, and we need to identify the residual risk before we leave our newest young son at home without us. Now, as parents, we all assess residual risk while we know it or not. Now, what's funny, and I told this to the folks, if you watch those commercials where they show the parent with the first baby, and they show, of course, the kid can't do anything without the kid being sprayed and everything being sprayed to protect the kid. By the second kid, maybe they'll spray a little bit, and by the time they have the third kid, they don't care anymore. So it's like they let the kid go. But we all examine residual risk in our lives, whether it's with our kids, whether it's with the level of life insurance, with the level of car insurance we have. So let's just go through an example. So our concern is we have a kid that our little toddler, we don't want to be injured or harmed at home. We're going to have to leave him at home. We have to go to work. We want to know really what's the inherent risk for us leaving our child at home, or risk for toddler harm or injury once we leave our toddler at home and we're not there to watch them all day long. Next is, what level of risk are we willing to accept? And like I said earlier, probably we get our parents, at least my parents over time, they didn't worry, again, you have more kids, you're like, oh, well, they'll be fine. But when you have your first kid, probably you're not willing to accept as much risk as you were when you have your first one versus your third, fourth, etc. So we then have to also look at what mitigating controls do we have to minimize risk to our child. Well, we can have a home camera, baby-proof the doors in the whole house, cover all the electrical outlets, make sure we have a pool fence, the right babysitter. Do we hire somebody who's not trained versus somebody who's a true trained nanny, etc.? So those are the types of things in toddler risk we're looking at. So how do we, if we had to calculate this, what would we do? So first of all, we're going to calculate what's the inherent risk for potential harm. I'm going to show you this on the spreadsheet that you guys will get. Secondly, what's the maximum risk tolerance that we're willing to accept? High, low, medium, or high? And we know for our kids, most likely it's going to be low. And what's the state of our mitigating controls? So we basically got to go around and look at these controls I mentioned. Are they in good shape? Not? Do they need improvement? Or are they really good? Which minimum says, you know what, this control isn't good enough. We don't have to do any more with it. It's good. So, and then step 4 is actually calculating what is our residual risk. We determine the state of how good our controls are. We take that mitigating control state and that score from our overall risk tolerance. This remainder is basically saying this is the score control we have, the minimum level we'll accept. And then and I'll show you in a second, once we get that, we'll say, is this remaining score within or outside the tolerance? So based out of that, step 5 is, now that we know, are we inside or outside of tolerance, A, are we going to want to spend more money? So for example, do we need a better home camera system if it's poor? Do we baby-proof everything? No, well, that's a simple one to fix. We don't have to spend a lot of money on that. Babysitter, a nanny could cost a lot of money versus a well-trained person who's not a professional nanny. We could still get the same job done and minimize our risk. So as you can see, you kind of do this already every day in your life, and we have to do this in our business continuity efforts as well. So let me take you over to our sheet. So let's take a look. And in the spreadsheet, tab 1 will be the simple example. Tab 2 will be a clean version that's a little bit more advanced for you to use for your actual plans. So up at the top is inherent risk. We have our toddler injury. And how do we rate that? Low, medium, or high? Well, based on our knowledge of what could happen to kids, our past history as parents, we kind of know that in talking to others, probably that the inherent risk for something to happen to our toddler's high. So we score that as a 5. Now, what's our maximum tolerance? What's the most tolerance we're willing to accept? Is it low, medium, or high? So in this case, as a parent, I'm going to say, you know what, this is my first kid. I'm willing to accept very low tolerance for any risk. And you can even make this 5% if you want it. 5, 10, 5, 15, 25, for example. But in this case, I just said 10%. So basically what we do then, we say our inherent risk times our risk tolerance. So basically what we've done here is we take our inherent risk, and that's 5, multiply it by our tolerance, 0.5. Now, so basically what we need to do, this becomes our tolerance, our max tolerance. We subtract our max tolerance from our inherent risk, and we end up with 4.5. What this means now is our controls that I showed here must be at 4.5 or higher. If it's under 4.5, we're out of tolerance. If it's over 4.5, again, we're perfect. Or in some cases, if it went negative, the score went negative, we're maybe doing too much because we're way over controlled. So let's take a look here. We've done this. We now will look at our controls. We find that our home camera system, we only have one home camera. And guess what? It's not working so great. So we rate it as poor. We're like, gosh, it's not in good shape. Now, we've done a moderately good job of baby-proofing our house. So everything's in pretty decent shape. Our pool fence, non-existent. Our babysitter, the person we're looking at, is not even a moderately trained individual. It was somebody that we found in the neighborhood and thought they could help, but they're not at the level we want. So when we look at all these, and do we contain all hazardous chemicals? Yes. We've done home spraying outside, so our kid won't be eating any bugs and won't be having any issues with any insects. Out of that, when you add up all our controls and how they end up, we end up with 3.2. What we do is basically take this, in the simple example, take these and we do an average. We ended up with 3.2. Based on that, as you can see, we have to have a minimum control level of 4.5. Our mitigating control state is 3.2. So you can see we're pretty significantly out of tolerance, 1.3. In the perfect world, we'd want to be at 4. All our controls would want to add up and be averaged out to make sure they're 4.5 or better. Now, so based on this, what do we do now? We need to take a look at which of these controls we need to fit, which one of these we want to spend more money on, which one of these make more sense. Do we really need a home camera versus saying probably the best bang for our buck is to maximize our pull fence, our babysitter, and make sure our home is baby-proofed. And by doing that, then you raise the state of your controls and lower your overall residual risk, which most likely will get you to 4.5 or higher. Okay, so this is a very simple approach. In the advanced version that I'll show you, it does have weighting for these controls, et cetera. That's what you'll get in the spreadsheet. So what are the options? Once we looked at that and we said to ourselves, my gosh, we're out of tolerance, what do we do? So the key thing is that we can either accept the risk, but guess what? It doesn't reduce any of the effects of if something should happen, right? However, how many of you in BCM offices endure this, right? Very, very important. How many of you guys endure this? When you're at your office, management just says, let's not worry about it. Don't worry about it. We'll just deal with it. We'll take the risk. Nothing's happened to us in the last 10 years, 20, 100 years. Just move with it. But that is a strategy. The second is risk avoidance, which is the opposite of risk acceptance. This avoids any exposure, but it's also, guess what, the most expensive. You've got to spend a ton of money, effort, resources, and time. And very few people, it's the most expensive. But again, unless you're in a specific type of environment where there is no, even NASA at that point will always accept some risk. When you look at some of the residual risk studies, they understand there's some things they just can't control the entire risk. So few people really move to the total end of risk avoidance. They'll do their best, but there's still some risk left at the end, but minimal. Risk limitation, this is the most common one. This is where you limit a company's exposure by taking some action. Maybe I'll get an 80% there. I will get us a hot site that will protect us, or I will create a site that allows us to protect 60% of the business. But I'm willing to say I'm not going to be able to protect it all at this point. So we may take some with some risk avoidance or a combination of a number of these. And then risk transference, basically saying, you know what, I'm not going to do this business anymore, for example. There's high residual risk in it. Let somebody else take it over and the recovery capabilities associated, recovery requirements associated with it. Now, a lot of people think by transferring risk that it's over for you. You don't need to worry about it. You still do. So you may transfer it initially, but you still need to know then on the back end, are these people protecting my business? And do they have the right plans in place? So again, the 4 options: accept the risk, do some risk avoidance, which means do everything you can to eliminate the risk, which is expensive, very, very expensive. Limit the risk through some levels of solutions, strategies, things to minimize it, but again, it's not total risk avoidance. And then lastly, transfer that risk out to others who assume it. But again, you still must monitor to ensure that they are minimizing or eliminating your risk. Okay? Okay. So how do we get to the point, though, that when we start to assess BCM residual risk? This is how we do it. And again, this is just our approach. It's not necessarily right or wrong, but this is how we approach it, and it's worked well for us. So basically, when we look at residual risk, we're looking at this residual risk for critical business and IT recovery plans. This was my approach, and I felt that by us getting it to the business unit or IT recovery plan levels, I then could roll the residual risk up, not just by plan, but then I can roll it up by division, I can roll it up by city, by building, which is over time that data becomes very critical because you can start to see trends or different areas that you can start to see why does one city always have a higher residual risk than another, or why does one executive owner who has so many plans under he or she that always have high residual risk. Do I need to change behaviors? Do I need more budget in this city? Is this business unit not deemed critical so management doesn't want to spend money on it? And with that, then you can always then go back to management and say, I have a high residual risk in this area or this division. I know it's critical to the business and it's our mission and strategy. We may want to, again, do some risk limitation or avoid risk depending on how critical it is. So by doing this in our residual process, we consider, of course, our criticality factors, our really important, our threat landscape, our risk tolerance, which is management's appetite or tolerance for risk, and then mitigating controls. This is the types of things we look at each individual plan. So at the end, really, when you assess residual risk at a plan level, it basically tells you how bulletproof and or capable each plan is. You know, in the perfect world, you'd want each of your plans to be within that tolerance based on how critical that plan is. Will that happen? No. But you sure can minimize it over time. And we've seen that with programs, whether or not they know they're doing it, by them putting the right process, methodology, and having the right behaviors, their plans, again, over time, they end up with the right strategies, the solutions. They enhance the complexity of their testing so that over time, the residual risk goes down without them even knowing. They may not have been measuring it, but over time they can recover, and they can recover in the time frame they need to be. And we've seen that work successfully. This is just a way of actually now quantifying it over time. Okay? Now, what we believe, because this does take some time, that really your folks should be given to those units and or systems or application recovery plans you want to evaluate that really have the highest inherent risk or most critical to your company. You know, start out with those in 24, 48. Maybe you only say, I'm only going to evaluate those in the first 72 hours that I need in my RTO. Because by that, you're saying, gosh, this is where some of my greatest risks lie. Also, what's most critical to my company. So don't try to do them all. And I would never recommend you'd worry about anything greater than 7 days. You know, I always try to even stop at 5 days and just say, this is the group that will be under my residual risk management. I will evaluate these because these have the greatest value to my organization. So some of the criteria we look at. Our first is criticality factor. This is the level of impact of the business unit or the system or application. This is solely based on its RTO. So what we basically do is we outline our RTOs and we assign an impact score to those. The more critical the RTO, the greater the score associated with it. And I'll show you that in a second. The threat landscape. Based on where this business unit or system or app in its environment, what's its level of threat landscape? Low, medium, or high? Okay? So basically what we do is we take its criticality factor, its threat landscape, that becomes its inherent risk factor. So basically how critical or impactful it is to the organization through its RTO score, as well as threat landscape, gives us its overall inherent risk. And that's really worked well because by having the RTO, you've already done the BIAs, you've already accounted for dollar and non-dollar impacts and a number of other things. So that gives us a really good idea as to criticality factor. The threat landscape then gives us, well, what could happen to it, what's the potential or probability for threats, and out of that then comes a number that says this is the inherent risk for this business unit recovery plan or system or application recovery plan. Okay? Now, very important is then the next is the risk tolerance, which is basically what's the level of risk we're willing to accept and you need management's help out of that. The mitigating controls you're going to need to be concerned with, you can change these. These are the ones we've somewhat settled on. Business impact analysis. Has it been identified? Our recovery strategy. We have different levels of that. How good is it? How bad is it? Can it recover the business unit, et cetera? Recovery exercises. What kind do we do? Do we do desktops or do we do full recovery? Our recovery plan, is it well documented, thorough, comprehensive? Is it in alignment? Our recovery team, are they trained? Are they aware, et cetera? And then also now one of the key factors we look at, third-party supplier risk. How well is that minimized? So those are the types of controls we look at, combined with the criteria, which we're going to go over. Okay. So what do I need to begin the residual risk assessment? Make sure you have your RTOs ready. You have an understanding of your threat landscape, high, medium, or low for the different locations or cities you're in. So you need to have an idea, do you have a good threat and risk assessment, which helps you then determine, the probability of threats occurring is a lot different in downtown San Francisco than it is in Boise, Idaho, for example, or in New York City, or even in Phoenix. So you have to have a good idea as you measure and understand the threat landscapes for different organizations or plans you're measuring, have a good idea, and give it your best educated guess. Get an idea of management risk tolerance. This is where you're going to have to educate them because you're going to have them help you. What level of risk are you being able to assume for those that have the highest inherent risk? The next level of inherent risk, all the way those that you say, this is our low inherent risk range, what level of risk are you willing to accept? Also, you need to weight your mitigating controls depending on importance. Each of those controls that I noted earlier have a different level of importance, and that's real important. And then lastly, what else do I need to have? How do I assess each of these controls? Are they worst case or are they best of class? And I'll show you that and how we do that. All right, and what access do I need? Basically, you need to go to your recovery plan, and also you need to maybe have some subject matter experts on these plans. Very good. So let's continue. I know I'm covering this fast. Just want to make sure I get done in the time frame. So first step, identify the inherent risk factor. So identify your RTO category, such as we did here. 12 hours or less, in this case, is our most critical RTO. All the way to, we just simply say, we throw everything in our last category, which is not critical, which is greater than 5 days. So as we stated earlier, I use this to basically establish the criticality factor of the inherent risk factor. So, and I like that because the RTO already takes into account, if you've done your BIA with it, dollar, non-dollar impacts over time. So it's done its job for me. So each RTO category has a level of potential impact. Basically what we do is we use a scale of 1 to 5, okay? And basically we assign that if this particular RTO, if we have a disruption, will we have any pain? So it'd be no significant, insignificant, all the way that if this RTO is disrupted, guess what? We have catastrophic. And we rate each of our RTOs based on 1 to 5, okay? And we assign that particular impact score over to our RTO. All right. Now, next piece we do is our threat landscape, and like I said, it's really simple. We take into account what's a threat landscape for that specific business unit or system or application plan. Where does it sit? Is it, like I said earlier, is it in New York City? Is it in a major area? Or just by the nature of that business, what are the threats and impacts to it, potential impacts to it? You know, make sure you understand natural, man-made, and technological. And we keep it very simple. So we say, based on the threat landscape for each business unit, we say, does it have a high potential? Is the threat landscape a high level of potential for threat impact? And we assign a 5. Is it medium, moderate? You know what? It's sitting now in an area that, based on where it is, and based on what we've seen in past, based on our threat and risk assessment, the moderate potential for threats and impacts to occur. And we rate that as a 3.5, and that's the score we use. And then low, you know what? Based on what it does and where it is, it has a low potential. We have this now sitting in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and there are really very little to no threats or probability we've seen over the last 3 to 5 years, for example. So keep it simple. Don't, again, best educated, I guess, is good. You want a place to start from and a baseline. Don't make it so complex for yourself. Okay. So based on, I'm going to give you a quick example. So let's say we have a global call center. It sits downtown in a major metropolitan business area. Very high potential for natural man-made threats where it's at, as well as technological threats. It sits down in a place where there's a potential for terrorist attacks because it's one of the top 5. Also, it has a lot of power constraints based on where it is. As well, it has a lot of neighbors that sit within it that could also cause disruptions, could impact it as well. It does around-the-clock information services that's very critical to government agencies. And right now, the RTO of this is our first category, which was 12 hours or less, along with all of its supporting systems or applications. So based on this, our RTO is 0, which we assign then we felt that our RTO 0, which is the most critical, we assigned a score of 5, saying basically it's catastrophic to us if that particular RTO category is affected. And then also based on where it sits, that global call center sits in a major metropolitan area with many different threats, natural, technological, man-made, that could affect it. Based on that, we feel it has a high threat landscape, and we assign a score of 5 to it. So the inherent risk factor is 25. So what does this mean? So basically it means, if you look at the different ranges once you do this for your units, 20 to 25 means I have high inherent risk. 12 to 17.5, I just did some math on this, moderate. Anything less than that is low. So business units or systems or apps with moderate to high inherent risk factors should be considered for residual risk. You need to know when to stop and say, it's not worth me measuring this. Let me go ahead and measure it, because these are the most critical. And I would start, again, if you need to start slowly, start with those that have high inherent risk, because those are the ones right away that you can get the most bang for the buck, have the most, you can maximize, the minimization of risk and look good. Okay, step 2 is management risk tolerance. This is when you need to get an idea what management's risk tolerance is. You need to educate them first on what residual risk is, what it means. But once you come up with your varying ranges of inherent risk, because remember, risk tolerance is a level of an organization that is prepared to accept in pursuit of its objectives, and before action is deemed necessary to reduce the risk. So we have our RTO, we have our threat landscape, that's our inherent risk before we apply our controls. Okay? So remember that. Risk tolerance is the level of risk that an organization is prepared to accept in pursuit of its objectives and before action is deemed necessary to reduce that risk. So basically what I did was this. Identify the risk tolerance for the range of inherent risk factor. So what I did is I took the criticality factor times the threat landscape. Remember that number I had, 20 to 25, 17.5 to 20, etc. Basically what I did is I took that number, because we're using a basis of 5, I divided by 5. So these are the same numbers. So 20 to 25, which is really after dividing is 4 to 5. Management, you may say, hey, I'm going to assume a low risk tolerance of 5%. Anything that has an inherent risk of 3 to 3.9 after being divided by 5, I'm going to accept the moderate risk, and anything greater or less, inherent risk is less than 3.0, then I'm going to accept 20. Okay? So now, very important for you to know this. What we've seen is management is always seems to be, and what we've seen, except in very few organizations, they're willing to accept more risk than you think. And this is what happens. This is where you need to educate them, because they don't believe it's going to happen until number 1. Number 2, you've gone 30 years as a company, or even in some cases, we've seen clients that are 100 years plus. You know, they've gone through every event that you can imagine and feel if they can survive it, they'll make it. And then thirdly, you have those companies that are so big that they are, you know what, I can write a check no matter what. So be prepared for that. But again, be able to talk to and tell them why we need to have a lower risk tolerance. Okay? All right. So let's take a quick look here. Here's our call center that we talked about. It's located in San Francisco, has a recovery time frame of 12 hours or less. And it's actually even probably less than 12 hours. It's probably around 4 hours based on its criticality, but this is the RTO time frame we set for that group. Its inherent risk, which is risk to business disrupted, is 5. Remember, its RTO was 0, and we assigned a score of 5 to our RTO 0. Its threat landscape, based on the fact it's downtown San Francisco, it's on Market Street. Based on that, we take our criticality times our threat landscape, divide by 5, because it's the math behind it. We end up with a risk factor, inherent risk factor of 5. What's our risk tolerance? After talking to management and that range, they said anything in that range of inherent risk, you know what, we're only willing to accept low tolerance. You can change these numbers. Maybe for your low tolerance, you say 10%, moderate could be 15, and high could be 20. So you could even change these as you see fit to work with your business. Now remember, as you set these risk tolerance conditions, that will affect your controls. That will affect everything around it as to what level you need to have in place. So just remember that. So once you change your willingness to accept risk, these numbers, as you make them lower, again, you're taking less risk. So just remember when you set these. So based on the fact for this specific business unit, what's our maximum risk tolerance? Our risk factor is 5. Our tolerance percent is 5. So the most we're willing to accept is 0.25. So basically what we're going to end up doing is take our overall risk factor, subtract this, and you're going to see in a second, our controls in this case have to be 4.75 or higher, which is really tight and very hard to get to that point because your controls have to be absolutely perfect. Okay. Real world, you're going to need to educate management on risk tolerance. Like I said earlier, they're going to accept more risk than you expect. Lower risk tolerances require tighter controls. So remember that. When you set the risk tolerance and you may set them low, this impacts the level of controls. What I'm basically going to show you in a second, that means all your controls have to be at world class or close to. They need to be at the highest levels, which is great to shoot for over time. And then also remember lower threat landscape. So let's say some businesses are even now saying, instead of me being in San Francisco, what if I move it to Phoenix, or I move it to another urban area that doesn't have as many threats? Well, that reduces your threat landscape, which guess what? You may not have such a high level of control, and management may be willing to take more risk. Okay? So once we've calculated that, the next steps, we're going to identify our controls, weight them, how are we going to assess the state of those controls, and then what's our scoring? We got about 13 minutes. So what's our planned mitigating controls here? I already went through each of these. You can change these. These are what we feel based on talking to folks, and some of those, a number of practitioners in the field. These are the controls that we're most concerned with by us evaluating residual risk at the business unit or IT recovery plan level because they're consistent for both. DIA, our strategy, exercises, plan, our team, third-party supplier risk, and training and awareness. Now, this is where a lot of people will get into the spirited discussion of how we weight these based on importance to the execution or capability of the plan. We weight these based on its importance, its ability to recover. Now, so what we like to do is all your controls then, your scoring has to add up to 100. You can change the math and say, you know what, I'm going to weight these and I don't care if it goes over 100. You can change the, there is a way to do that and in the spreadsheet if you'd like, and that requires a little bit more math. But I make it simple and just say basically the weighting for my controls have to add up to 100%. Now, once I do that and I start to evaluate each control for that plan, I say, is it a 1, which is scoreable, all the way to a 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, based on what I evaluate and where it's at. I then take the weight of that control, multiply it by its completeness and execution, which is 1 to 5, and then basically you end up with the totaling of those scores, and that gives you your overall score. So how does that look? Here's the controls that we use. Now, what we've done is one of our users actually had a list of all the different controls, and actually said, here's how we evaluate recovery plan, recovery team, BIA. And they had a 1 to 5 rating that came from industry standards as well as common sense and experience in the field, and said, here's how we rate it, 1 to 5, and it's poor, non-existent, all the way to superior. And then for each of our controls, we have the description of what each of these mean. And this is what we use to measure those. Now, all of you have been in the business long enough, you basically know for a BIA or a recovery plan or your recovery team or your exercise, it's really what a 1 to 5 is. And you can start to put those in as well, use industry standards as to what's a 1 versus a 5. So keep it simple. And you all know by your experience in the industry, really, is it a 1? Is it a 2? Don't spend forever trying to guess between a 2 or a 3. Use your best educated guess and your experience. Okay, so back to the business unit example. Here's our controls. Here's how we weighted them. And you know what? I will tell you right now, most people are weighting recovery strategy and recovery exercise the highest. Talking with those that I truly respect in the field and doing it for as many years as myself or even longer, most folks believe strategy and exercise deserve the highest rating. So in this case, we weighted those controls 30 and 35, our BIA 10, recovery plan 5, our third-party recovery team 10, and third-party exposure 10, add up to 100. So after evaluating each of those, our BIA was best practice, perfect, got a 5, multiplied times the weighting, 0.5. Our recovery strategy is poor, not good. So we didn't end up very good. We got a 1. And then so forth and so on. We weight each of our controls. We go through, evaluate those on a 1 to 5 scale, and then at the end, we get our mitigating control score. So how did this all work? Our business unit ended up with a risk factor of 5. Our tolerance was very low, 0.25. We subtract that from the 5, 4.75. Our controls need to be at 4.75 or greater in order to be within tolerance for this plan. We end up at a 2, which gives us a red light, which means we're in trouble. Okay? Very important. You can see you're way out of tolerance. You have a lot of work to do. And you can see just by looking at these, how you manage your controls, you can see where you need to work. You can change these weightings based on what you see is fit for your organization. But again, this is what we've seen in a lot of cases, people we work with in our user groups to see what they recommend. Okay? This is an actual report that comes out of our residual risk application. This was one of the folks that was in one of our classes that was kind enough to provide data. Here's where she actually came out of on one of her customer groups. They have less than 4 hours, and the risk factor for that particular RTO was catastrophic. Their management accepted 10%. Their threat landscape was high, and then she rated all the controls for her group. Here was the state of them, and then she ended up out of tolerance, outside tolerance. And as she said, we have a lot of work to do. She knows, see, this, now you can go to management and say specifically, what's the problem and where it is, pinpoint. You know, do I really need to worry about the BIA this time? But boy, I really need to worry about recovery strategy. Look at their exercise. A 2. Not good. So, especially when you have a group that needs to be up in 4 hours or less. Okay? Here was one that was absolutely perfect. There's a gentleman that was in our class. He truly ran a first-class program. He had a great quote. He was talking about that there's a greater risk in not doing it right versus doing nothing at all. And I agree with him. How many programs you know where people have been misguided and actually created more risk in the organization in the program than doing nothing at all? And he's built this program from scratch and truly is an amazing program. And this was one of his groups that he had. Service operations, risk factor was moderate. They accepted more risk. Threat landscape, though, was low, but look at the state of its controls. Put them well within tolerance. This is where you want to get. This actually comes out of our report. This was some of their items. But think if you could take what's in that Excel spreadsheet we're going to give you, be able to go to management and say, out of my RTOs, most critical RTOs, let's say my 4 hours or less, here's what's outside, how many are outside of tolerance, here's how many are within tolerance. Be able to show them specifically where your risks are. And then using your compliance and residual, now you have a complete picture of where you're at as a program. Very, very important. Okay, now, what do we do now? So now that we have an idea where they're at, we can easily then find out globally on an enterprise level, on a division level, what mitigating controls have the most significant risk. That's easy to figure out what's going on. Are we doing too much for some areas? Can we reduce cost? Are we really, because you're going to, in some cases, you may end up at zero, which is great, or you may end up in the negative, because that means at that point, based on the risk tolerance and the inherent risk, your controls are higher than they need to be. Or do we want to just say, you know what, we'll still pay for it? That's up to you. Or can we, what else can we do with this risk? Is something so high that we can afford? For example, I've seen folks that are really struggling with their call centers. They can't afford to provide a diverse call center in another location. And a lot of times, wouldn't it be cheaper to just transfer that risk to somebody, you know what, that can handle it, that has the multiple levels of redundancy, for example? And then what's causing the failure in our risk, in our mitigating controls? Do we need more resources, money? Is our policy or our standards bad? Or do we just have bad management? I'm going to tell you, in a lot of cases, what we see with BCM offices, they're not enforcing the standards, and they're doing the minimum possible with the business units versus getting them up to the level when it comes to exercises and strategy. So when you're done, you then need to take a hard look at a number of areas. The team, our standards, our BIAs, all the way down to third-party supplier risk. Really what you need to go, once you know where the risks are, you then know where to look. You then know where to go back in each of these areas and figure out what's really wrong and where do we need to move forward to minimize our risk. Okay, final thoughts, things to think about. We have found where the most significant critical exposures, as I said, what we've seen. Most of the time it's recovery strategy and recovery exercises. Third-party risk is still, I'm going to tell you, unknown. It is a crazy big risk, and people don't know where it is today. Very, very important. Very few people have manageable residual risk. So one gentleman I showed you from healthcare technology, he knows where his risk is. He's done an exceptional job. Most are focused only on getting the stuff documented, not really on execution. And if you can just get your critical controls from a low to a moderate, you're going to do a good job at mitigating risk. And remember, perfect's the enemy to good. Don't spend, if you can get it from low to moderate and moderate high over time, but don't worry about trying to make it so perfect, because I'm going to tell you, you'll never get where it beats. Get it to be executable over time. And again, focus on the outcome and really become target focused, and that really means ability to successfully recover. That's really important. So in summary, implement both of these. You need compliance. People fight me on that, but I'm going to tell you, you need to know where you're at in comparison to standards, and you need residual risk. Know where your significant risk exists. This will give you the ability to do that. Is it going to take time? Absolutely. Just do it. Do it a little bit at a time. Start with your most critical RTOs first. Do a few plans at a time. Then move up to the next set, and then do them on a regular basis. Make sure you have good action plans, because now you can go to management and say, we need an overall enterprise recovery strategy in these groups because they're terrible. Or these are really good. We just need more money to maintain them. Address the compliance risks. So on the back end, policy, standards, oversight, governance, plan documents, etc. And then always remember, all this comes back to staying target focused on recoverability. Okay? The next upcoming webinars, again, are Testing the DR Plan by Rich Long. That's in January 11th. And then we're going to be having a good one, which is really calculating return on investment. And we're going to be using the calculations out of compliance and the calculations out of residual risk and coming up with an ROI number. Are you an A, B, C, D, for example, or are you in the 90 to 100%, which makes you great ROI? So out of this here at this point, I am going to open it up and folks that have questions. Any questions from anyone? Well, I want to thank everyone for their time today. And again, my apologies for the technology issue on my end initially there, so we got that fixed. But again, my apologies for that. I look forward to hearing from you. We'll make sure all of you get the appropriate spreadsheet. Again, if any of you have, I'll stay off a little bit. If anybody would like to talk offline, more than happy to do that. Again, thank you everybody for your time, and have a great day.
Thank you, Michael. Michael, just maybe a question should have shared with you. Just is there a reminder with your spreadsheet of some of the the steps through? Because that's quite a bit. I assume that's why there's not a lot of questions. That's quite a bit of material to process all at once. So.
Oh yeah, we'll make sure, Pierre, we'll make sure you get the presentation too.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, that's great because that's kind of a walkthrough of that process, right? As you look at the spreadsheet and you go, what was that again?
No, Pierre, I was going to see if you could digest it all, and I know you're so smart, it wouldn't have been a problem.
Thanks, Michael.
You're welcome. Anybody else have any other questions? I know I covered that quickly. The class was like an hour and a half, but so we'll make sure you get the presentation in PDF along with the spreadsheet, and don't hesitate to call me, or send me an email. Hey, this doesn't work. It's crazy. What's going on? And keep it simple, folks, and it does work. It really does. And first of all, we can just get people to assess their compliance. I would be excited. I was telling everyone recently, out of how many people that I've surveyed in my classes, probably around 300. It's been crazy. The number is less than, I'm not kidding you, 2%, 3% that are really using the standard, and it's quite scary. So again, everyone have a great day. Be safe. And get that residual risk down. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Bye-bye.